Zoom.
Thank you. If I could have you turn to table 19, which is on page 110. So table 19, and also I will take you also to tables 20 through to 22. First, if I can just ask you to describe what table 19 is assessing it, or not assessing it, but setting out your analysis based on a certain method, which is identified as Stewart and Oaten to 1996. What is that assessment method, and what are you assessing here?
So the Stewart-Oaten method is a recognition that in many situations in environmental assessment, the data don't exist to clearly establish cause and effect linkages or assess cause and effect linkages in a quantitative way. And so there's also value in assessing evidence in terms of a weight of evidence kind of approach and a framework for that. So where you can assess a number of pieces of different sources of evidence to come up with a conclusion or an assessment of significance or not. And so Stewart-Oaten lays out a nice framework. It's a generic framework that we applied here. Sets out a framework by asking these series of 7 questions of the assessment that you're doing to come to a determination of significance. And so the first 3 questions in this table on the left-hand column refer to the pathways of effect between the stressors and sockeye habitats and the role in the decline. The 4th question relates to the consistency or the evidence related to the different life stages of the species of interest, in this case sockeye. The 5th question relates to the temporal pattern of the stressor and the decline. So is there consistency between the year-to-year variation or the decline in the stressor, for example? And the 6th relates to, is there spatial overlap, say, for example? So in terms of the stressor and the sockeye habitat, so if there's no spatial overlap, then clearly there isn't that coherence, that it's potential for the interaction between the stressor and sockeye. And then the 7th question is looking at the issue, or is asking the question about contrast. So if we have contrast in the decline across conservation units from high to low magnitudes of decline, and the stressors similarly have a similar pattern of decline, so where there is a very severe decline, but there's also a very severe stress, and at the opposite end there's a less of a decline and less of a stress, then that kind of gradient and the contrast across conservation units would suggest that there's evidence that there is a relationship. So these 7 questions, general framework for how we can pull together all of the different pieces of information and analyses that we did into a single framework for coming to a determination of the likelihood of freshwater influences having an effect or not.
All right, so just to summarize, all those questions that you see on the left-hand column set out this framework, and you, for each of those freshwater stressors that we identified earlier, you did this analysis. You asked all of those different questions vis-a-vis those stressors and the Fraser sockeye population. Is that right?
That's correct. So we did it for each of the individual stressors, and then this table here is a roll-up of given all of the results from all of those stressors. This is our belief about the importance of freshwater habitats in general.
Okay, so the response side is, when you say the roll-up, that's sort of your pulling together all of the different stressors and your overall conclusion for
Yes.
each of those questions for all of the Fraser River stocks.
Yes, that's correct.
All right, and then tables 20, 21, and 22 are essentially those questions that you identify, those Stewart-Oaken method questions, have been asked against each of these different freshwater stressors, and those show on the tables below. So the first question, how plausible is the hypothesized causal mechanism? That's answered for forest harvesting, that's answered for mountain pine beetle, and that's answered for roads, as an example.
Correct, yeah.
And there's 3 tables to cover off all of the different freshwater stressors that you identify in your report.
That's correct.
And it's a summary, really. This is a summary tool of all of the work that you described earlier in your report and that you've already reviewed today.
That's correct.
Okay, and those tables are identified, they begin at page 111, and they're tables 20, 21, and 22. All right, going back to table 19 then, where the response is set out, and that's just as a reference, I just want to ask you overall, what was the conclusion that you reached, having completed your analyses of all the different stressors and having asked all the questions that are identified in the methodology you used?
So we recognize that it's plausible that freshwater, changes in the freshwater environment due to natural changes in habitat conditions or stressors on those habitats, it is plausible that those mechanisms can have effects on production of Fraser sockeye, and that the strength of those effects can be large in some cases. And the scientific literature supports that there's the plausibility of those mechanisms of effect. However, given the plausibility of those things, the evidence suggested that freshwater influences are not explaining the declines in sockeye. So one piece of evidence in coming to that conclusion is the measures of juvenile productivity that were available for a subset of the conservation units have not been changing to the same extent that the measures of total productivity across the entire life cycle have been changing or declining. So if there was a relationship or one influence of freshwater habitats, we would have expected to see declines in juvenile productivity measures that in our analysis, and we didn't see that. Similarly, the timing in those cases where we had time series or available for some of the stressors, the timing doesn't necessarily doesn't coincide with the timing or the pattern of decline in sockeye. For instance, mountain pine beetle is a more recent phenomena. 2003 is when it really started to pick up, given that we're trying to explain a pattern of decline that began in the late 80s, and given lags of the expected lags of the effects of mountain pine beetle, say for example. Forestry is another example. Although there have been varying levels of forest development across the basin, in many watersheds, the level of disturbance has been relatively stable across them. And as well, in other examples, run-of-river hydro, for instance, the spatial overlap wouldn't explain the pattern of the decline as well. The run-of-river hydro that currently exists is largely focused in the lower Fraser Basin, and is not interacting in any way with the upper the conservation units of the upper basin. So again, that's a piece of evidence that suggests that it's not possible for things like run-of-river hydro to be explaining the decline. And lastly, the contrast in the intensity of the stressors across the CUs. Some do have high stressors, some have low stressors, but the pattern of that high and low does not coincide with the patterns of higher and lower rates of decline that have been seen across the conservation units. So the culmination of all that evidence leads us to believe that it's unlikely that freshwater influences are playing a role.
And if we turn
Ms.
to
Baker, I wonder if I could just, I apologize, I should have asked you this earlier as you were going through, particularly in this area, table 19. But in your report and in your evidence, you use words like habitat, freshwater environment, freshwater habitat, freshwater ecology, watershed, spawning habitat. Are these terms all interchangeable, or are you meaning different things when you use these terms? Because you seem to use them throughout your report, and I'm not sure whether you're talking about the same thing or expanded, whether freshwater environment is expanding freshwater habitat. Can you just tell me what the baseline is here?
I think, thanks for the question. I think it's important to be clear that we describe freshwater habitats specific to the sockeye conservation units and their life stages. So in one sense, we do use a lot of those terms interchangeably, so just to make that clear. And the concept that we're trying to convey here is that sockeye salmon at different life stages use different freshwater habitats. Spawners use tributary spawning streams and main stem spawning or downstream of lakes. So when we talk about habitats in a general term, we are referring to the life stage specific habitats like spawning, the nursery lakes, the migration corridors. So in the finest level of detail, I would describe habitats depending on what life stage we're talking about, but in a general term, we'd talk about habitats to capture all of those things.
And watershed?
Yes, watershed. So the other thing to add to that is there's a stream or a lake-specific section that a sockeye use, but streams are not disconnected from the land base. And so when we talk about watersheds or zones of influence, we're talking about that terrestrial area that has the potential to influence those in-stream or lake, nursery lake conditions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Page 57 of your report sets out, or 56 and 57 set out your summary and conclusions. And on page 57 of the second paragraph, you state that your assessment of the cumulative effect of freshwater stressors suggests that the recent declines in Fraser River sockeye salmon are unlikely to be due to changes in freshwater habitats, which is what you've just been describing. An important piece of evidence in reaching this conclusion is that juvenile survival has remained relatively stable across CUs where data are available, even though there is substantial variation in stressor intensity across CUs, and this is what you've just described to us.
That's correct.
The next paragraph, or let me just stop there for a moment. If that's the overall conclusion, are we to take from this that freshwater habitat and stressors are something we shouldn't be concerned about? Is that the upshot of your report?
No, I wouldn't interpret that from our report at all. In our analysis, we're examining specifically the relationship between the stressors and the vulnerability and a specific response variable, the declines in productivity. Habitat stressors and vulnerability interact with habitat with other measures of the freshwater environment. So water temperature, for example. So forestry can interact with those habitats to influence water temperatures. So there may be a relationship which then has an effect on sockeye salmon. It's just what we're saying here is that translating some changes in habitat it's unlikely that the changes in habitat are transferring up to a population level of effect. That is represented through the declines in productivity. So there may be some intermediate measures that we didn't assess through our analysis that could be where there could be relationships or effects, but we just didn't look at those things.
And when you say it comes up to a population level effect, you're talking about the aggregate population across all of the CUs on the Fraser River?
Yes, both aggregate and across the whole life cycle. So if we have a certain, the way that referring to an analogy that I've heard elsewhere, that if you think of the each salmon life stage as a link in a chain, and that there may be stressors that are interacting with those links in the chain that is imposing some mortality on those different life stages. If there is one link in that chain that is having the most severe constraint or bottleneck on the total production across the whole life cycle, that may be that's the most important driver, maybe the most important driver behind the declines in productivity. So if in the presence of that, it may be difficult to detect the effect of a stressor on another link in the chain, because the bottleneck is not alleviated, or there's that overwhelming stress on a different life stage. So it's not to suggest that there aren't other stresses on those other links in the chain.
Right, and as you indicated, you were looking, all of your analysis is measured against the productivity changes, and there's other factors that could be looked at, such as distribution of CUs or abundance of CUs, and those were not part of the work that you were doing.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay. You weren't looking at habitat impacts on distribution, for example. You were looking
Correct.
at habitat impacts on productivity.
That's correct.
Okay. Does your report, is your assessment help us in understanding then stream-specific or lake-specific or any kind of site-specific freshwater impact on the sockeye?
No, our report did not get into trying to understand the cause-effect linkages of individual CUs. So if one conservation unit is the abundance or the returns are not as strong as they have been historically. We haven't gone through an analysis to try to explain specific situations in conservation units. We were looking more at across the basin, more broad scale, what kinds of drivers might explain the variation in the declines that we've seen across the basin, not a specific CU.
On page 57, which is on the screen, there is a statement at the bottom line, actually the last line of the last paragraph, that says stressors that induce higher density independent mortality may have no noticeable effects unless another factor creates additional stress on the population. What is that? What do you mean by that?
Well, this is reiterating, or going back to the example that I just gave, and reiterating the point that given different links in a chain, and each life stage represents the different links, if there is severe constraint on one of the life stages, say for example in the marine environment, that is acting as a bottleneck on total production of Fraser sockeye, it would be difficult for us to pick up what the effect of impacts on freshwater environment would be, given that constraint in the marine environment.
I'd like to move to your recommendations. At page 59 of your recommendations, there is a second paragraph from the bottom, which begins with to improve our understanding about survival at critical freshwater life stages, that paragraph. We've heard so far in this Commission of Inquiry about certain juvenile assessments that are done on certain lake systems, certain populations, certain CUs. In your view, what kinds of data needs to be collected in addition to what is being collected now, and why is that additional information important?
As you acknowledged, there are some limnology studies, and there are some estimates of smolt conditions and smolt departure from nursery lakes and fries, but it's not widespread across the conservation units in the Fraser Basin. The existing information is largely focused on some of the larger stocks, and so to have better representation across the conservation units, certainly feel that these measures are important.
Why would that data be important to have?
Well, for one, helping us better understand. So although we conclude that it's unlikely freshwater is having a role, looking out into the future, that conclusion is also based on a handful of juvenile productivity data. Given climate change and other things that are happening, if we want to protect sockeye salmon into the future, we're going to be able to want to know and be able to assess more easily whether changes in the freshwater or marine conditions and the relative importance of those two things. So if we have a better understanding of what's happening in the freshwater environment, the survival through the freshwater environments, we will more strongly and quickly be able to act, if possible, to try to mitigate some of the impacts of mortality at those different life stages.
Respect to habitat monitoring, and just in your answer now, you mentioned some limnology work that is done by Canada, and we've heard a little bit about that in the hearings, the Commission hearings already. What additional limnological work needs to be done in your view, and why again is that kind of limnological work important?
Understand that there is relatively good representation of some of the limnology work across the nursery lakes, but again, given a purpose under the wild salmon policy is to represent both strong and weak, to protect the diversity of conservation units and strong and weak stocks, small and large. Believe that there's a better representation across nursery lakes is important to fill some of those data gaps that exist.
Right. If that kind of data had been available to you, would that have allowed you to better assess the impacts on the freshwater environment?
Yes.
Okay. At page 60, in the second paragraph, which begins with the phrase, to improve our understanding about the population level effects of stressors, you state here that the general mechanism of effects are known, but estimates of the population level significance of a given stressor level are crude. So that begins on the third line and goes to the fourth. What are you Can you explain that further? What are you addressing there, and what kinds of data needs to be collected or analysis needs to be done to better understand population level impacts?
So, given the analogy I referred to earlier about different links in the chain, I think we also need to understand, have a better integrated model of what's happening in the linkage, what's happening in the freshwater environment and the marine environment, and the linkages between the two. But as well, we need to understand. I believe we need to design deliberate experiments where we have contrasts and stressors in the freshwater environment, high disturbance, low disturbance, where we have an integrated understanding of nursery lake conditions and spawning extent and quality, so we can understand better how the freshwater environment and kind of how increases in different stressors can cascade to a population level. Currently, we are struggling to understand those linkages in the translation, given some of the issues we've talked about. We struggle in terms of translating given increases in mountain pine beetle or forest harvesting and how that can translate to a population level effect.
At the bottom of this page 60, the very last paragraph that begins at the bottom, with the phrase, to improve transparency in the science and related decision-making, scientists, managers, and the public need information that's more accessible. And you go on in that paragraph. What were the challenges that you experienced with the data available to you in doing your work?
Well, certainly a large part of establishing, I call it the baseline for our assessment, was delineating and defining the habitat information. So defining that and relating it to the different conservation units. So we had nursery lake delineations and spawning extents provided to us from DFO, but at least for the spawning extents, what that information wasn't also lined up with the conservation units as well. The watershed or the zones of influence on those different habitats was also not defined. So a big portion of our early effort was getting some of that baseline information to describe core habitats and watersheds of influence on those habitats for the different conservation units.
Right. So how could data be better integrated, I guess, to allow you or managers or scientists to do CU-specific work or assessment?
Well, I certainly think that given some of the, and we talk about this in some of the state of the science, but given some of the poor resolution of information on the intensity of disturbance, say water use, for example, and the lack of time series for a lot of stressors, we believe that if there was a stronger linkage between the agencies that are collecting those data and an understanding of the need for those data to understand how human activities are affecting freshwater environments. So if there was a stronger linkage between those, that there would be a bit of a feedback that the data would be more suited and better suited to doing the kinds of analyses that we were trying to do with this work.
And for each of the life stages that you identified in your report, that would be the migration life stage, the spawning habitat, and the nursery lakes, in your view, what are the key pieces of additional data which would be useful for managers and scientists in assessing freshwater impacts in the future?
Certainly along the migration, adult migration, I'm aware of Scott Hinge's work, but I think given the importance of water temperature along the adult migration, and understanding that for a greater number of CUs further towards the, not just kind of Fraser main stem and some major river tributaries, but having a greater understanding of temperature conditions along the full extent of migration corridors and across a greater number of conservation units would be helpful. Having a better understanding of the timing of smolt out migration, which is currently limited to a few lakes, few nursery lakes, that would be valuable information. Having information that describes the so currently there's a description of the spatial extent of spawning, but it's a static descriptor. It doesn't reflect the year-to-year changes in spawning habitat use of different CUs. And so having information that helps us understand how spawners are changing their use of different habitats and the quality of that habitat, the temperatures, the gravel quality, flows, having that available, and then having, as it somewhat referred to before, having better spatial representation in terms of lake sampling across the different CUs would be valuable as well for the nursery rearing conditions.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, when I went through the qualifications for these witnesses, I neglected to actually have them qualified as experts, so I would like to do that now. I'll start with you, Mr. Nelitz. We reviewed your CV, and that's now marked as Exhibit 563. And we reviewed your educational status and the work that you've done and the work that you focused on, and your CV sets out the various publications and reports that you've been involved with. And of course today we've talked about the work that you did for this project, and I'd ask that Mr. Nellis be qualified as an expert in environmental management, which would include policy implementation, management frameworks, environmental indicators, performance reporting, adaptive management, and in structured decision making, statistical analysis, and environmental assessments.
Thank you, Ms. Baker. Is there any participant who wishes to challenge the qualifications of Mr. Nellis? Thank you.
And with Ms. Wojtkowski, again, her CV is at Exhibit 570. And again, we reviewed the work, your educational background. Your CV sets out your publications in a variety of areas. We've reviewed the work that you did in preparing this report. And I'd ask that Ms. Wojtkowski be qualified as an expert in structured decision-making, risk assessment and management, environmental planning and management, computer modeling and simulation, and statistical analysis, all of which were involved in the work that she did for this report.
Again, any participant have an objection to that qualification? If not, then both of these experts are qualified in the fields in which you have identified. Ms. Baker, thank you.
Thank you. And those are the questions that I have for these witnesses. The first participant to question these witnesses will be Canada with Mr. Timberg.
Yes, for the record, Tim Timberg for Canada, and with my my colleague Geneva Grandy McNeil. The first theme, Mr. Commissioner, I have 10 themes to my questions, which I'll be asking today, and my time estimate is 2 hours. The first theme that I have for, I think primarily for Mr. Nelitz, is, and Ms. Wojtkowski, is going to be some questions about the statement of work of what you were asked to do. And so perhaps if we could turn to that, that's at page 30 of the ESSA report. Exhibit 562, I believe.
Did you say page 30?
Page 130. Or actually, perhaps it's easier if we could go to Roman numeral 3. I think there's a summary there. And Mr. Nelitz, you've stated that here that your report covers 6 freshwater stressors: forestry, mining, hydroelectricity, urbanization upstream of Hope, agriculture, and water use. You'll agree those are the 6 stressors you focused on?
That's correct.
And isn't it true that those are the 6 stressors that are in your statement of work? That's what you were asked to look at.
That's correct.
And so my question then is, in your experience as a habitat expert, are these the best freshwater stressors to use to determine habitat status?
In terms of on the stressor side, I believe that the categories of stressor are important ones and relevant. I think some of the ways that are available to describe those stressors could have been improved upon if we had better data.
Okay.
On the habitat condition, so I consider habitat status, as we've talked about in the report, as a combination of the vulnerability of the habitats and the stressors on those habitats. So on the stressor side, I've just made those points. On the vulnerability side, I think there are other measures of vulnerability or habitat condition.
Right.
Water temperature as an example.
Okay.
We didn't have that
Right.
across all the conservation units, so that was not part of it. And again,
Right. So those 6, though, stressors were selected. That's because there is data available for those 6. Is that correct?
I can't speak to why those 6 stressor categories were selected.
You were just provided with them.
In our terms of reference, yes.
Okay. So you did what you were asked, which was to focus on those 6, and I'm just sort of trying to get a sense of other. I think you said earlier that there are intermediate measures that also could have an effect. Intermediate habitat measures that might have stressors that might have an effect, such as. Would you agree that perhaps looking at amount of recreational time spent on a lake might be an appropriate habitat measure to consider the impact? Or length of foreshore development on a lake? Are these other kinds of habitat stressors that would be of assistance?
In terms of understanding status of habitats, yes, I do believe those are important. In terms of what we were trying to do here with our analysis, in terms of explaining patterns of decline in the productivity, I'm not certain that they would have been as informative.
But so then, but I'm just trying to understand then, if, for example, you talked about these bottleneck stressors and these sort of more localized habitat stressors on particular CUs, that's something that you've not done in this report.
That's correct.
And I'm just thinking for the Commissioner's benefit, if we could expand upon these intermediate measures that perhaps are still, that you'd agree these intermediate measures are still relevant to habitat.
Absolutely.
Okay. And so my list that I have here is amount of recreational time spent on a lake. That's like impacts of boats and recreational vehicles or boats on lakes. What about infilling of swamps and foreshore or sewage drainage discharge? Are those something that you would normally be considering in looking at habitat?
Again, I think it's going to be context dependent in terms of specific CU.
Right.
So the amount of foreshore use of juveniles in those nursery lakes, say, for example. So in general, yes. I guess I'm wondering, I'm trying to distinguish between what we were charged to do, which was looking at patterns of decline, trying to explain general patterns of decline, versus are these other intermediate measures important to explaining cause and effect relationships in individual CUs. I can't speculate and kind of go through each of the CUs individually and try to say like that might be important here, not important there, and whatnot in terms of local conditions, but but they can be important, but at an aggregate level of what we were trying to do, their importance is less in my mind relative to the ones that we looked at.
Certainly, and my point is simply so that the Commissioner is aware that there are other habitat stressors that are out there that are
Yes.
not included in your report.
Yes, I would agree.
Okay, thank you. And would you agree you've assessed these 6 freshwater stressors independently and you've not assessed them cumulatively?
I'd say we have assessed them cumulatively, both in terms of we developed a cumulative stressor, a measure of the cumulative stress on a conservation unit. So we did consider across all the different stressors. We did summarize that. As well, in the statistical analysis that we did, we looked at alternative models, so to speak, of interaction and whether multiple stressors could be acting to explain the patterns of decline. So we did look, I'd say, at a bigger picture, not independently. We did both an independent and a more interactive cumulative assessment.
All right. All right. And if you had considered these intermediate measures that we just spoke about, or these other habitat indicators, would that have affected your outcome?
My suspicion is no. Without having those data and having a better sense of those measures, that's hard for me to conclusively say whether it would have or not.
All right. The Fisheries Act and the Wild Salmon Policy provide a definition of fish habitat. And I'll read that into the record. It says, fish habitat means spawning grounds and nursery, rearing, food supply and migration areas on which fish depend directly or indirectly in order to carry out their life processes. Is that a definition of fish habitat that you are utilizing in working through your paper?
I would say it's consistent.
Okay, thank you. And would you agree that fish habitat refers to all species of fish, and generally it's not focused on a single species? It generally includes all organisms?
Yes, I would agree.
And as a general question, do you think that a single species approach is an appropriate manner to consider this topic of fish habitat?
I think that's a response that's appropriate for a manager, or the values by which somebody is managing a system as a scientist, in terms of as my expertise in terms of a scientist. I don't think it's in my place to comment on what's appropriate in terms of the values that are being managed or protected. So I just find that if you say, is there a relationship between a certain habitat condition and species X, I can comment on those things in terms of what's appropriate. I think that's a societal or value judgment in terms of what's what the values are that's guiding that.
Right.
I would say there's a relationship between habitats and all fish species.
Right, and so with respect to habitat management, what would you recommend if you were commenting more broadly on habitat with respect to the multiple species within the habitats you've considered?
I'm not clear on your question.
Well, I guess it's a simple question, is whether looking at habitat with a single species approach is the way to go. Is that in your experience the way in which habitat is analyzed? Or is it analyzed looking more holistically at the general habitat?
I think from an analyst point of view, the hypothesis that you're testing, which you can design a hypothesis or analysis where you're testing the relationship between habitat and one species, or you can look at it in terms of a habitat and multiple species. I think it's a value judgment in terms of what's appropriate in terms of one species or multi-species, and I don't feel as though it's my place to comment on what the right or wrong value judgment is.
All right. Do you have knowledge of how DFO manages habitat?
Absolutely, yes.
And how do they manage habitat?
I would say that getting to what I think you're trying to say is, I understand that the DFO is managing habitats for all species, all fish species.
All right, thank you. And I think you said earlier that there's a link between habitat productivity, between land activities and water use activities. You'd agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. And would you agree that generally there are higher levels of habitat stress in areas of increased development pressure?
Development being defined broadly in terms of industrial sectors and urban development.
That's correct.
Yes.
Thank you. And is the goal to habitat management to ensure that development pressure does not negatively affect habitat?
I don't think I don't feel comfortable to comment on that, or I don't feel I can comment on that. I'm not a manager, so I don't feel well versed enough to comment on what the goals of management are.
And perhaps you can just explain the limitation in your background with respect to why you can't comment on that.
I feel that my role in terms of this report is providing technical expertise and analysis around understanding the role of freshwater stressors and vulnerabilities. It's more of a scientific perspective. I'm separating that from what I think are management values and social judgments that managers, policymakers impose on some of that science in terms of what's appropriate and what's not. And that's not, as an independent analyst, that's not my role to, I believe, to impose those value judgments.
All right.
Given the terms of what we've been called to testify on for these proceedings.
Yeah, and I'm just trying to understand a bit more of your background, so that's helpful.
I have, so in terms of, if you're asking me about my background, I work with clients, the interface between science and management and policy. So I certainly have an understanding about what the linkages are and how science can inform management and the values. But when I work with clients, I don't interject my own values and tell my clients that these are the values that I think you should be managing for. I help elicit their own values and and to be very transparent about those and to try to match that to some of the science.
Thank you. My second theme is to ask some questions with respect to the objective of the Pestle and Cass report. And so Ms. Rutkowski, are you aware that perhaps we should turn to the Pestle and Cass report, actually. This is at tab 1 of Canada's binder. And Ms. Rutkowski, have you seen this document before?
Yes, I have.
If this could be marked as the next exhibit.
Exhibit number 572.
If we could turn to page 5 of the report, that's page 12 of 88, on the bottom right. And the bottom paragraph there, section 1.4, project outline. Ms. Rutkowski, are you aware that the original purpose of the Pestle and Cass report was to develop a ranking tool for Fraser Sockeye that would allow a prioritization of assessment projects, and that it was commissioned by the Pacific Salmon Commission because they had funds through the Southern Endowment Fund, and they were getting peppered with a variety of proposals from various researchers to do different work to assist Fraser River sockeye salmon, and they didn't have a methodology to set out who gets what and where certain projects should be funded and where they should not. Are you aware of that background?
I was aware that the Pacific Salmon Commission had commissioned the report. With regards to the other details you mentioned, I was not aware of that. By reading the report, you get a sense that there is strong emphasis about being able to prioritize CUs, but that was based on my own understanding of their report, not based on information.
Will you agree then that the primary purpose of the Pestle and Cass report was not to assess the status of sockeye conservation units? Instead, its purpose was to prioritize assessment projects.
I don't know if I can agree either way, not having been privy to the information from Pacific Salmon Commission about why they commissioned the report. Hearing it from you, perhaps I can make that conclusion, but I don't know the true, or I don't know the underlying rationale for the report.
Well, if we look at this paragraph, though, it says the ultimate goal of this work is to establish a consistent, transparent framework that translates general policies and objectives into practical guidelines for prioritizing assessment projects. You're aware of that?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And then it goes on talking about the different end users generally bringing their own assessment priorities and sometimes even their own budgets into a complex multi-agency planning and implementation process. And this paragraph goes on to explain that this is the point to this project. You'll agree with that, obviously.
I agree, yeah.
Now, the Pestle and Cass used the conservation units from the wild salmon policy as they were known in 2009. Isn't that correct? To your knowledge, they built upon the initial work of Holtby and Saruna
Correct.
in 2007. And if we could go to figure 13 of this at page 64. Figure 13 is page 64 at the top, yeah. And we're going to look at that table on the left. We can just focus on the left-hand side here. And so, Mr. Wachowski, figure 13 is a table of Pestle and Cass's evaluation of 36 conservation units. Isn't that correct? That's their assessment?
Part of it, yeah.
It says at the bottom, tree map of status evaluation for 36 conservation units.
Yeah, their assessment also included a component of vulnerability, which is not included in this figure.
All right. And at the time that Pestle and Cass was working in 2009, the work of Dr. Holt was happening simultaneously. Isn't that correct? And that Pestle and Cass did not have the benefit of the work that Dr. Holt was doing.
I can't comment on that, I don't know.
Okay. And will you agree then that Pestle and Cass's assessment of conservation units is not based upon the wild salmon policy of upper and lower benchmarks between the red, amber, and green zone? They use a different system. You'll agree with that?
They do have a method for defining benchmarks. Their method for how they came about categorizing those benchmarks is different.
They don't use the red, amber, and green assessment under the wild salmon policy, isn't that right?
No.
They don't use it?
No, they don't.
Thank you. Pestle and Cass's focus is on the current status of the conservation units and how much confidence could be placed on that estimate. Because of this focus, they evaluated severity and uncertainty as their primary indicators. Isn't that right?
So could you repeat the question?
Pestle and Cass focused on severity and uncertainty. And you can see this in, well, perhaps we can go to figure 12, the page before, page 63. These are the two focuses that Pestle and Cass rely upon.
As one component, yeah.
And as I understand it, severity is about the status of the CU, and uncertainty is about the availability of data on the CU. Is that right?
I think it's more than just availability, it's the confidence in that data, so whether there be data gaps or errors in the estimates, or I think it's more comprehensive.
Right. Yeah, and they were looking at that because they were trying to decide which project gets money for which CU where there's an absence of data. So they were looking at absence of data as a significant factor in their outcome, because that's what they were being asked to do, isn't that right?
I can't comment on why they were looking at uncertainty.
Okay. So if we go back to figure 13, Pestle and Cass then under the severity column, here use the numbers 1 to 5 to rate each CU. You'll agree with that?
Correct.
And their rating system is 1 is very good, 3 is moderate, and 5 is very poor. You'll agree with that rating system?
Yes.
And on the issue of uncertainty, if we could go to page 57, we've got figure 6 here. Oh, I'm on the same document, page 57.
I meant PDF.
Oh, 64 of 88.
Okay, that's
So here, I guess my question here, with respect to this figure to assist us, uncertainty is largely a question of the availability of data and its quality. Those are the two factors. That information needs to be accurate and needs to be available over time.
Mm-hmm.
And then the uncertainty indicator is there, and that's relating to the information as to whether it's available and whether it's available for at least 10 years. Could you comment on the importance of having data available for a long period of time when it comes to looking at sockeye salmon? Why is that significant? Why is it, if you just get data from 1 year, why is that not very helpful? Why do you need longer term data information?
You need longer term information because you need to, if you only have information for a given year, you don't know whether or not, you don't have a frame of reference in which to place that 1 year. You don't know whether some anomalous environmental event occurred in that year. So having a longer time series allows you to put that one data point into a context, a historical context.
And so any recommendation that this commission may make about data collection, it's important that any data that starts, new data that is collected in the long term. Would you agree with that?
I'd agree with that.
Okay. And the source of the data that Pestle and Cass is relying on is the salmon escapement database system maintained by DFO. Are you aware of that?
Yes.
And we created a new document which my friend Ms. Baker took you to this morning. It's Exhibit 571. And what we've done here for the assistant of the commissioner and yourself is we've created the Pestle and Cass column here, 1, 2, 3, 4 over. And what we've done is we've reproduced the numbers here from the Pestle and Cass document at table at figure 13. And those are, would you agree with that? Those are the same numbers? We've taken them from the severity column.
Yep.
And
With the caveat that there are some CUs that are not there, which Pestle and Cass did look at.
Well, let's consider that. What I'd like to do is explain the index here. So we've got Pestle and Cass severity scores in the 4th column. And then what we've done is we've removed the Stewart, early Stewart conservation unit as per the recommendation of Sue Grant in her paper. She says that that's not an appropriate conservation unit. Do you agree with Ms. Grant's recommendation that that be removed as a CU?
I don't think I'm in a position to comment on that.
Okay, I think it's worthwhile looking at it though. This is at Ms. Grant's paper, which is at Exhibit 184, or 97 of 194. And at the bottom there you'll see a section titled Stewart ESTU and I'll just read this. Ms. Grant says there are 2 sites in the Stewart ESTU CU, both of which have only 1 year of data, or negligible escapement data. And then further on she says, sockeye are observed in these creeks only when spawner abundance in the Takla Trombleur CU is high, or migration conditions have been stressful. And then she says, these populations are not genetically distinct from the Takla Trombleur ESTU CU and are not persistent. Therefore, this CU should be removed from the Fraser Sockeye CU list. Are you able to agree with Ms. Grant's recommendation?
My understanding is that there are internal discussions within DFO regarding the CUs and that it's an iterative process, and I'm not privy to all the nuances that are ongoing with regards to what constitutes a CU, and so I stand by my previous statement that I don't think I'm qualified to answer that question.
Okay. And the one thing that Pestle and Cass, Grant et al., and yourself agree upon is that there are 11 CUs in which there are insufficient data. That's your part of your conclusion at present?
Again, we didn't actually do our own assessment of status, and so conclusions that we made in this report with regards to CU status and availability of data are based on the work of Grant and then Pestle and Cass. So
right.
They should be in accordance.
Okay, so that's an important point then, that the work that you've done is you took Pestle and Cass's work, and then you looked at the work of Grant et al., and then you've come to your conclusion. That's what you've done.
Correct.
And so you've used the same data and the same statistics that they used.
Correct. We didn't do our own independent analysis or checked their analyses. We
All right.
took them as is from their reports.
And I think you just agreed with me that over time, the determination of CUs may vary as new information comes to light or circumstances change.
Yeah, I don't think the list has. As my understanding is that DFO has not published a definitive list. They've acknowledged it's an evolving iterative process.
Okay, thank you. And looking then at, if we could, sorry, Mr. Lund, thank you. Looking back at Exhibit 571, you'll agree then that Pestle and Cass, their conclusion is that 5 of the CUs are in poor or very poor state. And at the top of the list, we have Cultus Lake is very poor, it's a 5. Kamloops, Takla, and Widgeon are 4, so they're poor, and Takla Trombleur are 4. Those are just reproduced from their table.
I'd agree with that.
Okay, thank you. Then my fourth theme is looking at the work of Dr. Carrie Holt.
Mr. Timberg, I apologize for interrupting, but I noticed the time. Do you want to start?
Oh yeah, I would like to take the break. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Hearing no, adjourned until 2 p.m.